preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Welcome to a new kind of synergy. The first time the 92nd Street Y has participated jointly in a program with the Guggenheim. Before saying anything else, I want to say thank you to Linda Gehring and the people at the Guggenheim who have made things so smooth for us. Welcome to slightly west of Lexington Avenue for the first of our 4 Artist Visions series this season. Artist Visions at the Y, a number of you may know and others may not, has a long and happy history consisting of a number of absolutely wonderful artists. And this season we are privileged to begin with Nancy Graves, to go on with Robert Motherwell, Kenneth Noland, and Philip Pearlstein. And we're also especially, I'm supposed to caution you, by the way, that this is a recording. Taping or recording of any kind is strictly forbidden, so consider that registered. We're quite privileged to have as our moderator this year, Jack Flam. Jack Flam is professor of art history at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow, as well as having won a fellowship awarded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is I'm giving you the boilerplate. I'll tell you what I really think of Jack in a moment. He is the extraordinary art critic for the Wall Street Journal, where he enlivens those middle pages with wonderful art criticism. He has also won first prize in the Manufacturer Hanover's Art World Award for Distinguished Newspaper Art Criticism. In 1987, he won the Charles Rufus Maury Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Art Criticism. This last award was for his book Matisse, The Man and His Art, 1869-1918, which I commend to you as one of the most wonderful books about any artist I've ever read. A short personal note, and that is that having known Jack Flam, I know that he is one of the few people who bring to the distinguished world of very strong art criticism and scholarship a tremendous breadth of understanding in the humanities that is quite rare. And thus we're privileged to have him introduce and moderate tonight's artist, Nancy Graves. Now, Jack Flam and Nancy Graves.
It's a hard introduction to follow. Can you hear me? Is the mic picking up? Now? Now. Okay. First, thank you for coming. We have, I think, an extremely interesting series this year, great diversity in terms of the kinds of work that the various artists do. And I'm particularly pleased to start this year's series with Nancy Graves, who in recent years has come to be recognized as one of the most exciting, original, and vital sculptors, artists in America. I'm also pleased to have Nancy here tonight for another somewhat personal reason. Nancy is the only artist in the series this year who's younger than I am, which is, in addition to being our only sculptor. And also, as those of you who know Nancy's work are aware, she's someone whose work goes against the grain. I think it goes against the grain not only of a lot of contemporary art, but against the grain of a whole tradition of making sculpture. Her use of color, her use of eccentric forms, her use of organic biomorphic forms in a very sort of dissonant way, or sort of based on dissonant harmonies, really goes against the whole main, or a lot of the mainstream of Western sculpture, while at the same time incorporating an enormous amount of that tradition. It's a wonderful, paradoxical body of work. Nancy Graves was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and I mention this for a particular reason because that is, as you probably know, the home of Herman Melville. She grew up in a museum milieu. Her father worked at the local museum, which was both a natural history and an art museum, something which is commented on very frequently in relation to her work, and I think has an enormous resonance in her work. When she went on to Vassar, she studied English rather than art to begin with. And in fact, when she then went on to Yale to work for her MFA, she started out as a painter, so that her route to sculpture has been a circuitous one in which she has also amassed an enormous artistic, literary culture. After she graduated from Yale, she went to Paris, which is what people did in those days, to study art, to study painting, and to look at the great masters that were available in France. Eventually went to Florence, where she began to produce what I guess could be characterized as her first mature work. In 1969, she had the first one-woman show at the Whitney Museum, and after that, there have been an enormous number of exhibitions, prizes, honors of various kinds. In particular, I'd like to note the 1987 retrospective that she had, which was seen at the Hirshhorn Museum in Santa Barbara in California, at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, and a show that just closed a couple of days ago that I hope most of you had a chance to see, a really wonderful and a really very strong show at the Knoedler Gallery just a few blocks down the road from here. So I'd like to welcome Nancy Graves. And I would, since she has had this recent show, I thought that it would be a nice, or we thought that it would be a nice point of departure to talk about her most recent work, and specifically the work in the show, which we had a chance to see together and talk about together. And perhaps we should start, do you think, with the slides?
Yeah, I guess everyone can hear me. So, how do we do this? Is that forward?
Yeah, that should be.
Put my glasses on.
Can you see okay?
I can see that I'm in the image. Do you think we need the house lights down a little?
Yeah, we probably will once we get a slide on. This happens around 92% of the time that one gives a lecture with slides.
Well, I should tell you about a lecture I gave in Melbourne. It was publicized for 3 weeks, and finally when I got on stage, the technicians left, and I was asked to speak for 20 minutes in the dark about my work. So this is a much better. But what we're anticipating doing is talking about the material that some of the images that were in the Knoedler exhibition, and we're going to try and talk about them together. I think that needs to be, yeah. This was not in the exhibition. This is the first of this body of work which incorporates castings made from original castings of classic, mostly Hellenistic sculpture, taken from the Parthenon or the Elgin marbles. The Pennsylvania Academy of Art had these 19th century casts made in plaster, and I was given permission to take castings of details of Venus de Milo, of Diana and Aphrodite from the Elgin marbles, of Theseus, of Laocoon, and there are 14 different classical forms, and they are the newest decision I made in terms of imagery for the sculpture that was shown at Knoedler recently. So this is the predicate for that, and the problem for me was how to integrate something that was so familiar and so historically known with the body of found images that I had I consider to be my inventory. When I make sculpture, generally I have 500 to 1,000 cast forms available, so that when I am assembling these various forms, which have been selected because of their function as well as their visual meaning, their structural potential, their weight, their size, the assembly process can then be fairly rapid, which means that I can build a piece of this size maybe in 2 separate time periods, and I would say in half a day to a day, working with a welder. One of the things that you might be interested in knowing is that these things are heavy. They're cast in bronze, steel, and aluminum. They have a great deal to do with balance and tension of the various forms. I'm interested in projecting into space by the fact of welding, which technically gives a greater strength than the metal itself has, to each of these forms of moving out in space in a 360-degree manner, for example. And I think we should have the house lights turned down now, don't you? Oh, they're
Okay. Now, do we want to start?
Well, all right, so...
Could the house lights go down now, please? Yeah. There we go.
Great, okay. So here is do you know his name, Alkyonis or something?
Mm-hmm.
I need my art historian colleague to help me. Can you?
No, I can't remember.
Anyway, this is from the temple at Pergamon, which exists in East Berlin in the museum there, and this head which you see it's something like Alcamenus, and this is an image which I have included in the paintings and the drawings which I've made. I wasn't able to cast this, so it's a two-dimensional form. And I show it in the position, as you can see, it relates in a certain way to the kind of activity. This is a Hellenistic sculpture also, the kind of curvilinear, gestural motions that are in this frieze, and the sculpture which I have made happenstantially on the right, but I think there's a similar and related energy there. And of course the head in both cases is the focal point, because that is psychologically the most meaningful source of content in the sculpture that I made, and which is what I was trying to say earlier is the problem. If one chooses to use content that is from the human figure, it's a very difficult area to become involved with. So I chose this because of the challenge.
Can I ask a question, actually? What was the impulse behind your movement to the human figure in your recent work? That is, previously you had worked in the camel series, for example, with animal forms, and you've all along been working with organic plant forms, biomorphic forms, but this overt use of the human body is relatively recent.
Well, one was the challenge in terms of it being a very difficult area to become involved with, and then its relatedness to art history and my intuitive wish to be able to do something with the figure which has not, which would cross the borders. And one of the problems is, to what extent can one use a part of any form? You will see possibly later that there are not just heads, but parts of heads. And then once I went from parts of heads, I sectioned them off so that you would be able to read the form without the eyes, or you'd be able to read the belly without the navel, or et cetera, et cetera. And it is an interest in, it has to do with perception, with recognition, with historicity in a certain sense. So I guess the answer is the challenge that it meant to me.
Mm-hmm.
No. Well, now we do.
Do you want to?
I wanted that one, but it should be this one. Okay. Now we want to go back. Well, I think you can see this is not what I'm doing. This is a Henry Moore on the right, on my right. And the story of bronze up until my decision to try to make it a direct process for working is essentially that all of the work was done by the artist in another material, in plaster or wax. Then a mold was made around the bronze, around the original, which would be the plaster or the wax. And wax was then painted into the mold. Then the wax was put in a shell. The shell was then taken to something called an autoclavir, which is a way to melt out that given material. And then bronze was poured in. And in the case of Rodin or any number of sculptures, they hardly refer to what then we have as a record of their work. For example, if you start looking at turn of the century and earlier sculptures, you'll find that the parting lines are left on. The sculptor never cared enough to even take them off. And I decided that it could be possible by casting directly many of these forms which were organic or which I made myself, which would become unique pieces in themselves, that these could be would have the potential as building materials. They could be integers or parts of a given sculpture for me, the meaning of which would only be known when I finished it. That is to say, I would not make drawings before, but I would investigate the process of building, of the balance, the tension, the interrelationship of part to whole as a viable dialogue for the making of a sculpture. And so you can see that I did not do a Henry Moore, and my predecessor, Donald Judd, and the minimalists are, in a certain way, the thinking, that and pop, which I have reacted against in a certain sense, because all of us are living, in the same time, and there are certain things that are going on, and whether we totally understand what our reasons for doing something are, there are counter tendencies, and so this very clear, reductive way of thinking about sculpture is something that you can define rationally, and then you behold it, and that is its essence, is the antithesis of what I'm doing. In my work, there is a gestalt, yes, but every time you look at it, there's something more to be seen, and I suppose in a certain sense it has to do with my understanding of literature and the fact that I have read a few novels, and it seems to me that every time one reads a great novel, there's something more to be gained from it. So that is the attitude I have about sculpture and about painting. And that feeling is not a no-no, that people have feelings, and there have been feelings in the history of art, and that can enter work as well. And that would answer Jack's question as to why I was interested in introducing the human figure in another way. Mm-hmm. Let's hope I have better luck here. All right, so here is a Rodin. And here is one of the pieces that was in my exhibition. Now, of course, this is a happenstantial choice, but you see the kind of energy that's in one and the other, and yet they're not specifically related. The interesting thing, however, in the Rodin is that it is balancing on one point, and that, of course, it's not able to do so. It has to be attached to a base, otherwise it would fall over. And in the case of my work, there is no base, but it does stand up in a very tenuous way. There's sometimes more than one point of contact with the floor. Very often there are three, but the delicacy or the lightness of the way in which the floor is related to is something that I'm very conscious of. It's as if I've turned the figure upside down. Instead of standing heavily on 2 feet, the sculpture is now standing on its head. if you can, I'll show you, I guess, if I can move. This is Theseus's pectoral, and there is Theseus. And that is one of the forms that, that I chose to have a cast made of. And of course, it's highly colored, and Jack was referring to the fact of the color in my work, and that it is something that I've introduced in sculpture with the assistance of the foundry. These are all patinas. That means that there is a cupric nitrate base, which has been painted on with brushes to the heated bronze, which is heated by a gas torch, and that would make it green. Cupric nitrate is what bronze oxidizes to become, just as does copper, because bronze is 90% copper. And then over that, I paint on these colors, which many of which are artist pigments, which have been put into cupric nitrate. And then these are all indoor works because the colors are not able to withstand extreme conditions of pollution and sun. Then to protect them, there is an acrylic lacquer sprayed on them, or wax, depending on how the size of the piece and how delicate it is, so that they are not going to change over time with this protection. Now, what I have been able to do with this patina, this coloration, is to create another layer or another plane or another way of reading the sculpture, and to continue to permute the original meaning of any of these forms. Let's say the fan, for example. The fan has its own history. It's something that I found in Chinatown. And then I had it backed with wax so it would be strong enough. At that point, when it was cast in bronze, it weighed 50 pounds. It was 3/4 of an inch thick. It came out much heavier than I had hoped it would be in point of fact, so it wasn't so easy to use, because something that heavy is difficult to build with. But it retained the history that it had in life on one side, which shows the paper, and the side that you're seeing is sprayed wax, so it has a porosity which holds color in a different way than the other side would. And then the question was, once it became part of a sculpture, how to create a dialogue between parts through coloration. And there are obvious things that go on. One, if you know what color a hand is, for example, I wouldn't want to paint a hand flesh color. I'd paint it something else, because that again would force you to look into it in another way and read it as hand, but that it had become something else through its color, as well as its placement, as well as the permutation of the casting process, and then where it was originally, which would be the hand of Venus de Milo. So color continues this permutation, and it adds another level of composition, plus that it has a dialogue with the history of painting. And as you know, I am a painter as well as a sculptor. Now, this is a detail of the piece that I just showed you, and you can see the chest of Diana from the Elgin marbles, who has a green patina with violet. And then on the right is, or I guess it's stage right, on my left, there are bronze and aluminum castings which are on the floor, and they're laid out because I was interested in working with these at any given time and building with them. Many of them have been cut, as I mentioned earlier. You see this. This is the same form here in bronze as over there, but I cut out the center part, which was a way of my testing to what extent this amount of information can still be received when it is pushed even further by being a positive and a negative space at the same time. And so my work then was containing a history of itself and in its own building, which means that it's not just about the final result, but that the work has a great deal of meaning as an end product of a process. many of the aspects I'm attempting to describe to you. So you see the silver is aluminum and the gold is bronze. Aluminum weighs a third the weight of bronze, and there's one of the pieces that I'll show you later could only have been made because the aluminum was on the top. So here is Laocoon, this blue head, one of the 14 images, and there he is, the Hellenistic sculpture. And there we are in the patina area, actually. You see somebody with a torch on the left working on the sculpture before it was completed. It has the found object attached to it, the horn, a found object which is a steel plate that has been cut into. And logically for me, it's another level of permutation, because not only now do you have to question what the thing was in life, but whether it's cast or not, because there are parts that are fabricated as well as parts that are cast, as well as parts that are found and not cast. So every part has a distinctive meaning in terms of its process.
Did you have a program in mind when you placed the horn-like form? When I say a program, that is to say, when I first saw this piece, I thought of it as being almost a kind of announcement, like with a jazz trumpet, of improvisation, almost as if it was emblematic of the improvisatory nature of the sculpture as a whole, and of your work as a whole. I mean, it seemed to me, especially where it was placed in the gallery, past the entrance,
yes,
almost like a kind of signature piece.
Yes.
Was that conscious on your part or not?
The placement was, I guess, unconscious, but I understand what you're saying, and I did recognize it once it was there and let it be. The fact of the horn, I can't even think of the cone shape, at a diagonal has the meaning of being suspended by its placement in the air, and it's. I can relate it to the gesture of Laocoon, that arm that's facing left. It's a similar gesture, although of course I wasn't referring to this sculpture when I made my piece. And you can see the cast vines, which are twirled. They're directly cast vines, which means they're solid bronze and weigh, let's say, 50 or 60 pounds apiece. They, of course, interface with the snake, this curvilinear imagery, which is part of my inventory and which led to the decision to include Laocoon, and also a thinking of mine which has to do with a Baroque sensibility at this point. Not Baroque in terms of the classical sense, but what is the meaning of Baroque? You know, putting everything together and yet trying to at the same time hold it down with fairly clear decisions in terms of structure and form and process.
I'd also like to remark, it's something that doesn't show terribly well in the slides, but as you're looking at the slides, to point out that there is often, although they seem to be anything but geometrical, her sculptures, there is often a kind of geometrical overtone that runs throughout pieces. Even the fan, for example, is, among other things, a segment of a circle, or the cone form up here. And I often find that there are kind of geometrical ghosts around the sculptures, as organic and biomorphic as the specific forms themselves are. It's something to just point out as we're looking.
I find that necessary to introduce, as a counterbalance, the geometric with the organic, and I think that's something that makes it distinctive from classical sculpture, meaning anything that's come before that has to do with figuration. I mean, here you can see Laocoon. It is all organic, but in my work, there's constantly this demand that you recognize, hey, everything here is fake. Everything here has been transformed, and everything has been put here for a purpose. It's not just something that's pretty, pleasing, lyrical, playful, fun, whatever lighthearted descriptions have been made of my work. There are very clear decisions, and it's introduction of the geometric, which calls you up to halt and think about what is going on. And here you can see the forms stacked on the shelf and then laid out on the floor. Lots of dust, etc. The monstera leaf, which has been for the last 7 years at least a very strong element in my work, which comes out of my, well, it has to do with the form that any one of the leaves is a marvelous way of joining. Its dimensions are about 25 inches by 20 inches, but it has to do with Matisse, who has a great influence on my work, and in terms of the coloration, I suppose would be the logical one to whom I would be indebted.
I should say that I've never seen these slides and I've never seen your studio. And when I see this, the thing that leaps to my mind is Delacroix's comment, nature is a dictionary. And it's as if, for you, nature is a library. And here it is lined up on the shelf. It's fascinating.
Now, I'm not quite sure but in any case, to get to the paintings, I made drawings, which was, oh, I know, we have a snake in this, in the drawing on the left. And then on the right, as a so-called base, is this rope form, which was a silken rope, and I assume it was from a Japanese temple. It was given to me. And it was a major element in this show. I was creating a body of work for a particular time and place, which was the Knoedler exhibition, over a period of 8 months. And so I had to order a certain number of these in 2 metals, in aluminum and bronze, and I knew that they were going to be base elements, one way or the other. And one of the problems I had in the making of this show was that the foundry did not complete the production of them on time, so that all of my working needs were delayed to a great extent. In this case, the rope element is in bronze, as are all of the other forms. The spiral is made of copper, and the wheel is a found object. The wheel is painted with an outdoor polyurethane paint, and the bronze forms are all patinated. So there is a contrast between the shiny surface of the outdoor paint and the opacity of the patinas, some of which has a pearlescent paint in it as well, so that it reflects the light. But you can see the openness of this. Everything seems to be very delicately balanced on everything else. And so unlike my precedents, you can see this piece in the round from any point of view, and you are invited to go around the piece because of the way in which it's drawn, the way in which it's put together. Here's another view of it. And you can see how my effort is always to reveal as much of any form at any one time as possible. This is Venus de Milo's head. It's again my effort to take what was half of her face, and then I made a zigzag so that it's the hair. And once one is familiar with that particular form, it becomes quite clear that that's what it is. So this poor head is holding up all of this mass and weight and on 3 very delicate points. So it's a testing of both what the eye can perceive and what the metal itself will do in the construction of these forms with the figurative elements. There's a second found object, which is a windlass from a ship made of bronze, and that's this element here, which is holding these 2 points together. And then this is a stainless steel rod, which is the same weight as bronze, but it's twice as strong as bronze. So I have a few of those stainless steel forms around in case I get into trouble and want to do something that's fairly delicate. So that's what that did. There's Venus, and here's more of the inventory. These are fabricated forms. The spirals, which I had made of copper and aluminum, And then there's some aluminum rod, which I had ordered in 3/4 inch and 1/2 inch, and bronze rod. And I drew on papers and then worked, so that means that one plane was described for my assistants at the foundry, and then worked with them in terms of the planarity of it, how to put it out in space. But I have made now with one welder over 300 sculptures in this foundry, and he is very knowledgeable and able to interpret my thinking. There's Venus's head upside down. That's by mistake. It should be the top of the sculpture. And the leaf you can see in detail, and that's a breast of Venus de Milo, but it's the inside of it. It's the part that would be the inner casting if it had been the original, and yet it has another meaning. It's again, oh, which side is this? You recognize what it is, but then you realize you're not really seeing. You're seeing the back of it or the inside of it. So it of course makes another demand on one's perception. And there she is. That's the same image, only the lighting is different, and there's the detail of it upside down. So you can see that I was using similar forms in any number of ways, and that became interesting for me, because then the one sculpture would lead me to try something else, but with the same content, but in a different way. So that in the case of the show that I had, there was explanation of one sculpture by seeing what went on in the others, and that for me was of interest. And here's more inventory.
What's interesting to me also is that this is a very literal and tangible instance of something that characterizes a great deal of modernist art generally, which is that you invent the language that you use. It's not simply that you use a language in an inventive way, but that you, in this case, you are inventing the units as well as the syntax that's going to hold those units together.
Jack and I were talking a little bit about that this afternoon, and I was saying that what I think is distinctive between, let's say, art up until 1920 and the art that's being made now is exactly that artists not only invent new forms, but they have to invent the language at the same time. That is to say, no one is going to seriously try to make a nude and cast it in bronze. Those days are over for any number of reasons. But to relate to a nude or the figure is still a need for all of us. And so the question is how to do it. And here is a Voltri by David Smith. And it's not the example that I wanted, because Smith in many cases did work in the round to a greater extent than this, but this piece is pretty much planar. And I wanted to use that as an example of one of my parents or mentors, and to try to show what my thinking was as opposed to Smith, who has influenced me very much. And I'm also indebted to Calder, who, if you think about the stabile, which has a base, and then it's an effort to project through balance from that. There's something that I've learned from Calder in terms of the way that I think and the way that I assemble. But of course the technique is completely different, as are the materials and the processes. Uh-oh, I did a really good one here. Well, this is a test. This is a 10-foot 6-inch sculpture, which has an aluminum structure on top.
Maybe someone in the projection booth could flip it so the floor is at the bottom.
I'm going to reverse. Can you write that sculpture, please?
Is there someone up there? Yeah, now there is. If you could, on the left-hand side, is it possible on the left-hand machine, the next slide, to write it? That's it. not this one, but the very next one, which is tilted on its side. Because I think that with that particular piece, where the balance is so important, the way it comes up off the floor and then flies off to the right-hand side. Okay?
Yes.
It's this one, right? No, that one. Oops. Okay, we're a little closer. We'd like now that's the floor. The floor should be on the bottom.
Give it a 45, not a 180. In any case, the sculpture which you are about to see, we have to reverse though, I guess, for them, is bronze at the for 2/3 of it is bronze, and then I had to decide whether or not I could, a piece as open as that is and balanced on 3 points, which were very tenuous, how I could continue to build. And the interest for me was the contrast in building between aluminum and bronze. And heretofore, I'd used them independently. First of all, you can't weld aluminum to bronze. And whenever I had joined them, it had to be through bolting or some kind of tongue and groove, but the two metals do not go together. And consequently, are we ready? Is it changed now? Oh. The only option was to try to work with aluminum.
Okay.
I can't believe this. The aluminum is anodized, which is a process that occurs after the piece is built. And the metal first has to be treated chemically, which is outside of the foundry, and then I paint on the colors, which are aniline dyes, and then the piece is treated again chemically to seal it in. The problem is that it needs to come apart in order to go into the vat. So it's a little bit like printmaking. You don't know until you've finally completed all the stages what the heck is really going on. Although I'm the only one who knows. Nobody else has any idea. So that it takes a lot of intuitive imagining in order to make a piece which does use this anodizing process, which is the very transparent, very bright, chemical-looking colors, as opposed to the more organic ones in the patinas. And I like that contrast. So I was very much interested in a piece not only that would have the lightness, which would be a tour de force, and stand up, the aluminum part would stand up on a very delicate structure, but also would have a contrast in terms of its surface coloration.
Are you able, do you sketch the colors out? That is to say, how do you actually figure the colors in your, physically before they're put onto the sculpture? Since there's such a complicated process of preparation. Right.
I guess the first thing is to select the colors, because there are many colors that I don't use, so I have to work with somebody to get the colors ready for me, and I tell them exactly what I want. And once I've made that decision, then I look at the sculpture and I think of it as a composition in 3 dimensions, which is actually, for a painter, quite a phenomenal thing to be able to move into, because you're doing what you always have dreamed of taking 2 dimensions and making it 3, and you already have that. So then you're going into the 4th dimension. And so that I think I have to think about the whole and in this figure in the round, so to speak, and how, when I place the color in one area, how that's going to interface with what goes on the other side, if it be more 2-sided or 3-sided, and create another surface structure. And that's where the challenge and the interest is.
Do you sometimes have the colors, or do you frequently have the colors in mind as you're building the piece, and it's in metal?
No,
before?
not in the welding stage, no. That's something that I don't think about at all. Until I'm confronted with the green patina, that's when I begin to...
So the color is a kind of counterpoint in a
Yes.
certain sense
Yeah.
to the form.
Right, definitely. And then there'll be, in terms of the building, since I have objects available to me with which I then work, there can be areas which I want to call attention to, for example. And consequently, I will, I guess it's not ready. I will make a decision right off that this is where red's going, or this is where blue is, or for example, if it's a face or some part of human anatomy, the choice of color is important because it affects the perception of the piece more than if it were a leaf or a cornice or what have you. So I would make that decision initially and then work things therefrom.
Yeah, I notice also very frequently the use of color and surface patterning in the anatomical parts tends to go against the integral quality of the anatomical part itself.
We're going to forget about that
Yeah.
slide because I have it in another place anyway. Okay, so it's this one. Well, this is the base of that sculpture that I wanted to show you. I'm not quite sure what's going on now.
Okay.
What I wanted to show is the relationship between this Michelangelo Dawn, I think it is, and a sculpture which this sculpture, but in another view, in as much as it has a reading which is of a total figure, even though it's made out of parts that are disparate and have nothing to do with human anatomy, because of the placement of the head and the rhythm and the scale of this piece, which is related in 1-to-1 to human scale. It does have a relation to classical sculpture. There it is. And I give up on this.
Here.
Maybe you can.
There we go.
Okay, no, there's got to go back now. You're going forward. Oh, no, I guess it was there, so we can't do it. All right, so that you saw the Michelangelo, and now you see the head of Venus de Milo, and perhaps you can think of this as a figurative form of a head with a body with legs going in this diagonal position. The slide on the left. That was what my point was to be in including Dawn.
Oops. Well, actually, before we do that, I think, let's see if that slide is there on the right for a second.
It was...
No. Okay. The cubist slide.
Oh, that comes up later.
No. Okay. We'll see it later. Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
We're going to go ahead without that large sculpture that, because these are all details of it. On the right, and that is Laocoon's head with a fan. Again, these forms that are continued in the last 10 pieces that I've made. The vines. So these are details of it. Is this left or?
That's. Yeah.
Okay, that's another sculpture. So let's just keep going with this. No. Well, you can see with the organic forms here, the snakes and the vines. There's a relation to the Laocoon. And these are details of the sculpture, which has the aluminum on the top, and it's reversed, and the fan at the bottom. This shows you the anodizing of the aluminum and the contrast in the patina of the bronze and the anodized metal, which has a very shiny surface before it's anodized. This is a bleach slide. It's much brighter than that, but here's the top of that large sculpture, and you see this energy that's somewhat related to that of the Laocoon with these curvilinear forms which are projecting in space. But in this case, of course, they're open. They're not coming out of marble, which by its own right isn't that strong, and consequently the massive character of it has to be much larger than cast or fabricated metal.
I'd also like, before you let that slide go, to point out on the upper right-hand side of the right-hand slide, the hand gesture.
It's something that, again, is not easy to see in slides. One of the things that was very impressive in the show is that as you walk around the pieces, frequently walking around pieces of sculpture in which individual parts are not recognizable, suddenly you're met not only with an anatomical part, but with one that has a very specific kind of gesture. Not only the gesture of the part itself, the hand itself, but the way in which the forms that it's riding on top of function not as an arm literally, but as forms that give you the thrust that is like the thrust that projects a hand forward and makes it into a very elegant gesture.
But in addition to that, of course, its main function is that of support. It is structural. And the other is what is perhaps more easy to see. But this hand is doing something. It's not just there. And yet it has a very unusual reading because, of course, it's separate from Venus de Milo. And here it is on the other side. You see the inside of the casting. And the color, of course, is very unrelated to what is on the other side. So it has a completely different reading, different energy, different meaning in terms of the whole. And this is a detail now of another sculpture. And Henry Moore comes in here again as a way of showing how unlike this point of view, which is that of taking a given substance of a certain size and then cutting it away. I'm doing absolutely the antithesis of that as having known forms as a beginning and then building in space with them, defining a larger space than they, of course, are in their point of departure. Here you see the Diana from the Elgin Marbles in a horizontal position, which caused someone to say, oh, that's a landscape. And of course, when you start seeing horizontal planes in a Renaissance-like space, the eye tends to read them traditionally as a landscape. And so that gave another meaning than I had anticipated. I discovered that in the building of it.
It's fascinating, too, because that kind of metamorphosis is something that you find used consciously often in Renaissance art. Leonardo da Vinci talks about those kinds of transformations of hair or drapery into landscape elements.
This is a detail of the piece that I just showed you. Again, you see the hand, which is holding this large circle of metal, which is something called a spillover. It's the bronze that falls onto the floor as a result of the pouring of the metal. There always has to be a residue of an extra amount so that they're certain that enough has gone into the mold in the pouring process. And this was a circular form that had a great deal of surface incident in it, and it revealed the process to somebody familiar with what it means to take a crucible of bronze on a crane, heat it to 1600 degrees, be encased in asbestos and goggles and steel-toed boots, and then pour this metal, and then have this thing fall on the floor. So I saw it one day, and I asked if I could have it to use in my inventory, and the foundry gave it to me. And there is the Elgin marble, and you can see the form, which it's this one that I chose to have cast. And here is a painting. Well, this is Venus de Milo. I'm not sure whether we showed her again earlier, but I took her belly, her breast, her head, and then in these paintings, I was interested in the juxtaposition of cast elements. They would be cast in aluminum, and the painted elements, which would be an extension of the canvas plane, which any number of artists, of course, have tried. In this case, I made the forms myself in wax and then had them cast in aluminum. And you can see that this wave image, which is in the painting surface, is the cast anodized aluminum that projects from the canvas at about 12 to 15 inches. And of course, as canvases are physical, one sees this in any number of angles, and it becomes a physical and sculptural presence with a different light quality to it. It takes soft light, it glows in soft light, it reacts to sunlight by projecting light from it, whereas the canvas absorbs light. One is opaque, the other one is transparent. And so I was interested in introducing a number of these cast elements on the surface, in front of the surface of paintings, as a way of creating another dialogue between painting and sculpture than that which is going on in my sculpture. Are we at the right?
Yeah, actually, I had wanted to, this is a little out of sequence, but earlier when you were showing the Venus sculpture and talking about the way in which the forms read, though not in a continuous way, it occurred to me, having spent a lot of time in the Picasso-Braque show recently, that opening up, not only in a drawing like this of the pictorial field, but the opening up of the whole nature of relationships and continuities has a very strong cubist matrix to it underlying it. I think that whole notion, even though at first glance your work, and I think the slide on the left-hand side makes a good match actually with the Picasso drawing on the right also. In a way, the last thing you would think of in a sculpture like this is analytic cubism, but I think there's the sort of underlying pictorial series of tropes is really quite similar. Anyway, that was the point. That's why I slipped that drawing in.
I like it.
This is a terrific piece, partly because of the way in which that very strong geometry and very raw metal, which is not painted at all, is played against the organic forms on the bottom, and which are also brightly colored. A really terrific example of pushing contrast to their far limits and making the piece harmonize anyway, stay together.
This is anodized aluminum in sculpture, and then this is a detail. Wait, I have to go back.
While we're looking for the slide, may I also remind you that when you came in, you were given a card, and if there's a question that you would like to pose, there will be a question and answer period afterwards where we'll be taking questions, and if you could, it would be helpful if you could write questions that you might have down on the cards that could be passed forward.
You see this is a fish form which has been made in wax and then cast in aluminum and projected in front of the surface of the painting, and you get a clear idea of the aluminum with the painterly surface on it, which tends in this slide to be too bonded to the paint surface itself. And the size of this aluminum piece is about 4 feet. It's quite large, and the painting is 7 feet square, so it has quite an impact. The content in these paintings comes from, it's also recognizable, as is the figurative forms historically in the sculpture. And this fish, of course, would be a Japanese image. There are images from Hellenistic sculpture, from Egyptian art, from San Marco in Venice, which would be Byzantine, from Ravenna. Any number of known figurative forms, faces of women and men, the snake form, which is a symbol, of course, they're paradigms, the fish, which is a symbol both in Judeo-Christian iconography as well as in any other civilization. And these are juxtaposed one to the other. This is a drawing which predicated the paintings, where I started to work out some of the layering. Each of the images which in itself is a known form, was considered to be in a separate plane. That was the logic of their overlay. And there are any number of different images which then when they were placed on the canvas, the figure ground problem became much more complex. Initially it was a black ground, and then I did away with that, and the ground itself became as meaningful as a painterly gesture as did the so-called drawing of the very specific images that I was relating to. This is the best Calder that I could find, which is a slight embarrassment to the artist. But anyway, it's a stabile, and I mentioned it earlier. It is my explanation of the heritage which I have, which is that of taking a sculpture and dealing with balance as a point of building. And this is the artist who did that so well. Here's another one, a skull from the Last Judgment, the wave images, snakes from Egypt, the water image from Japan, a symbol from Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel, a samurai figure on the right from Japan. All of these cultural icons are juxtaposed in one surface. Here's a painting which is 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide, and there's a snake image which is projected from the canvas, and in a certain way is counterbalanced by the green gesture, where the painting itself becomes some of the painterly gestures as strong as the projected image. The snake form was made of corrugated paper, which was then backed with wax and cast directly, and then anodized as aluminum. Again, the gesture of the snake is similar to the curvilinear forms of the rod, the bronze rod, or some of the rhythms in the fan, or the palmetto leaf, or the drapery. Surface incident, which is played one against the other, is another way of thinking in terms of the building process. I choose forms which are similar for their rhythm, their positive and negative space, as a way of continuing the dialogue from one form to another. And that is true in the two-dimensional work also. You see the wave form. It acts in a certain sense like the perimeter of the fan, that zigzag rhythm. The wave in its curving form causes the eye to move throughout the painting surface. And here is the Sibyl from Michelangelo, and there is a painting that I'm trying to find which also has that image. And then just to show as contrast, this is a Tony Smith called Cigarette, and this is again an example of minimalism, which is clearly something that I'm reacting against. And here's the fish on the canvas, and you can see how it's projected in front and out from and above and to the side of this canvas, how its color can be red because behind it is black, and it also has a painting behind it which relates to the image itself, that of the fish. Here's another one of these drawings with any number of classical forms. There's the snake form again. This is a koroi from the Parthenon in Greece, and there's a painting, I don't know where it is, but which has this form in it. I show this watercolor, which is from probably 1985, and it is, I do so because this is a kind of gesturing and coloration that is also in the paintings. It's a kind of drawing which is abstract, that is combined with the very specific content and serves to bridge the figure ground area of how you make an image on a surface and how the surface responds to the image. And this is Theodora from Ravenna, the consort of Constantine, which is a mosaic, and there's her crown on the right. Theodora's in silver and blue, and the crown is anodized aluminum projected from the canvas. That's the Sibyl on the top, and I showed you that of Michelangelo. This is, again, the aluminum projecting from the canvas. And there's a head on the right, and it's related to this head of Alcmenos from the Pergamon altar. And this is the choroi that I tried to show you earlier. That's projecting in aluminum and then painted on the surface of the canvas as well. And the watercolor is used again as an example of.
Are the watercolors studies for paintings, or are they ever?
They were made in '85, and they were considered to be complete in themselves, and they came out of an attitude I had about gesture. But of course, having that is part of my past. It's something that I recognize is related to the consideration of color and form in the newer paintings. On the left is the hand of God from the Sistine Chapel, and then there's an image of Eve, which is also from Michelangelo's, one of the layers of these paintings. Depending on where you look, you find a different plane, a different area of recognition, which is both in terms of content as well as its spatial disposition. And that's true in a certain sense in the sculpture, depending on what you look at in the sculpture. Defines the way in which you see the whole. They are complicated pieces, unlike, for example, the Tony Smith, where you pretty much understand what it is when you stand at any one point. In the case of a complicated sculpture of mine, a large one, which is very much in the round, the meaning accrues in the seeing of the piece and continues to grow as you continue to create or realize more information about it. So it's a different attitude. And there is the hand, as you can see, which was in the painting that I just showed. And here's Theodora. I showed you her crown, which was separated from her head, this beautiful mosaic from Ravenna. And then on the right is the head of Alcmenos, and it's in an orchid spray.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should do questions.
Okay.
All right. So I think now
If we can put the lights
if
up.
we could have the lights.
Also, could the ushers bring forward questions? Do people have questions? I have some questions, but I want to let people ask their questions. Yeah, maybe we just take questions from the floor directly.
Sure,
Yeah.
why not?
Where do you obtain your found objects?
The question is, where do you obtain the found objects from? One of the reasons that for the cards is because I'll just repeat then.
Anything that I see that has to do with my daily life or travels or whatever is a consideration. If I'm in a restaurant and I see a breadstick, it might become a bronze or aluminum. Or if I find a plant form and am lucky enough to get it to the foundry before it dies, then that can be encased in a shell and cast directly. Anything that has the potential of being buildable, that has a structural potential as well as it has a source of surface incident, a kind of rhythm, and it continues to be an addenda to the various levels of meaning that I have already incorporated in my work, would be considered as a possible castable form.
This question and your answer made me realize something that I'd never thought of before, which is in a certain sense, you're like somebody who walks around with a sketchbook all the time, drawing everything, except you're walking around pulling things out to sort of go into the mill hopper to end up on the shelf as a form to be used. I hadn't realized that the process was so ongoing. Okay, thanks. There's some other questions back there.
This is perhaps going to be hard to answer, but it's an intriguing question, and I think it might be interesting. What's the nature, how do you see the nature of your struggle as an artist, the psychological process? Now, the same person asked a second question, which is something I had wanted to ask you about, which is perhaps not unrelated, which goes back to the camels that you did in the late 60s. And perhaps, since the questions about psychological process are sometimes hard to get a handle on, how do you now see the camels from your vantage point, at least, what is it now, 20 years later? And that whole aspect of your work. I found when I saw your retrospective at the Hirshhorn Museum that although they look very, very different, the camels, which are kind of almost a kind of biomorphic minimalism in a way, nonetheless there is a real continuity of expression, of voice there already. Do you feel that? Do you see it that way?
Well, in the way that the subsequent work evolved, the gesture of the camel, the structure of it, the building that was necessary in order to create it, caused me to consider how to make a very large form stand on a very limited base, and how one could project diagonally from it, and to what extent that would be possible. So those early considerations, just in the making of this piece, which had to come apart in seven different parts, and whose inner structure had to be very well worked out in steel and wood, with soft materials covering it. And then where I experimented with fiberglass, with latex, with wax, with various materials which subsequently became part of the way I worked up until '77 when I started casting in bronze. That was definitely a point of departure for me. In terms of content, I then logically went inside, and which I was aware of when I made the camels, and became involved with the scientific aspect of natural history. And I had understood that that was the direction in which I wanted to work, and to take it as a point of departure, as a visual source of content, which then I would explore, with a kind of literalism, which is also true of the cast material today, and a specificity to its source, so that in a sense it's related to these classical forms that I'm choosing. I mean, they are there. They are not deformed except in terms of their fragmentary aspect, and then of course their meaning has become something else. But that was true of the camel also. I took it out of the realm of science and taxidermy, brought it into the art world, and of course no one knew what the heck it was. They thought, well, is this something real? Is it a taxidermied form? And you know, why should this be in a museum, and why is it art? It caused a great deal of consternation in '68.
I remember thinking exactly that in 1968, in fact, '69. A couple of people have asked a question that I don't know if you can answer. I don't know that I could answer this either. But it is, why do you assume that the nude is no longer a subject for sculpture?
Well, I haven't seen anyone working in that manner.
Successfully.
So that was why I assumed that.
I'd like to say, by a way of example, without wanting to seem overly deterministic historically, that it seems that certain kinds of forms become exhausted, the expressive possibilities become exhausted, and they somehow don't seem to sit right at a certain moment in time. And perhaps the best answer to the question that I can think of is, if you go to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, there's the stone monument under the ground, the black stone with the names on it, that I think is terribly moving to almost everyone who goes, which is in a sense an abstract piece of sculpture architecture. And then there's that sculpture, that bronze traditional figurative sculpture up on the hill looking over it, which is one of the most god-awful, banal things imaginable. And I think maybe that's an example of why it seems that certain kinds of straight representational sculpture are difficult to be sustained at this moment in time
for whatever mysterious reasons there are. How do you ship your work to avoid it breaking? That's something that until you explained it to me at the gallery last week, I'd always thought of too.
Well, first of all, any of those pieces has to get in the door, which once you become a sculptor, you become very much aware of architecture. And that means that nothing can be larger in width than something like 34 inches. And the height, of course, has to be related to any given door, because just the fact that it got in the Knoedler door doesn't mean that that's where it's going to be forever. And so one has to become aware in the building process of how things are going to separate. So as I create a work that's, let's say, 9 feet tall or in human scale, I have to discuss this as I'm midway in the building process with the foundry people, and we decide how it's going to come apart. And that might in turn affect certain other decisions that I'd make to finalize the structure of the piece, as I might have to add 1 or 2 more pieces, or I might anticipate in advance that the piece was not completed and that I would be adding other forms to the work. And so this is the way it is as one works in metal. As to the fact of they're not breaking, I mean, anything can break if it's continually rocked in any one point. Stainless steel, which is the hardest metal that I work in, if it's continually shaken, will break over time. But if it's properly packed, it shouldn't. So there are very few problems I have with these sculptures, even though they seem to be as fragile as, I mean, they look somewhat fragile.
What was the nature of the feedback that you got from your 1987 retrospective, and how did it make you, or did it have an effect on how you perceived your own work?
There's a question for you. I guess the pleasure for an artist to see, I guess it was 20 years' work at that point, which had been selected, not directly by myself, but by E.A. Carmine, who organized the show from the Fort Worth Art Museum, as well as the Catalogue Raisonné, was to see it together and to realize that even though I'm continually trying to surpass what I've done before and to attempt to work in different areas, that there is a certain line that goes through the very early work all the way to the present. I mean, some of it has to do with the fact that I am a human being. I'm one person. But there are other things that have to do with the way in which I see, and that was the interesting thing for me, to realize that no matter what I thought I was doing, there's certain rhythms that I like, certain colors that I continue to use in various ways, and to be able to walk through a large room with that number of works. I think there were 80 works in the show. Was probably the most meaningful thing. You also become more objective about how you fit into time and history when one has a show such as that.
Mm-hmm. Do you make your own forms also in addition to the found objects?
I make many of them, yes, and any of the forms that I bring in, I have to work on. They have to be painted in wax in order to reinforce them. I have to determine how thick it is I want it. I have to tell them what kind of a surface I want. There are any numbers of ways that the surface could be handled and approve it before it's sent out. Also, there's a cost factor. They have to give me a price for every single form I bring in, which is it is phenomenal.
This is a bit of a bombshell question, but I'm going to go ahead with it.
Ready for bombs.
How do you feel about political issues as related to your art, such as in the examples that are given, such as Nancy Spiro's or Sherry Levine?
Well, I'm not making political art, and I respect those artists who do so, but it's not. It's really not my concern.
Mm-hmm.
Now, somebody asked a question, why the choice of combining classical imagery with contemporary imagery? And if the person who asked the question doesn't mind, I'd like to sort of extend the question into a slightly different, I mean, not different field, but maybe take it a little bit further. Because I noticed that that your matter, your syntax, is always coming out of your formal references are always coming out of one tradition, and your subject matter seems to come out of other traditions. There seems to be a tension between the two. Is this something that you've thought through particularly? I mean, what are your feelings about that balance?
Well, let's define then what where I think for both ourselves and the audience, what is the tradition out of which the formal process?
Okay, I think the formal process, as I see it, is a formal process that comes out of transparency, construction, tensions and balances, as you pointed out. I mean, two of your strong predecessors, people who have obviously inspired you a lot, are David Smith and Calder. In that respect, at the same time, your subject matter is frequently tied to the real things of the world, and the Venus, which I think came out to some degree even in the slide, for example, really does act kind of integrally as a figure, metaphorically, and so there seem to be both of these things going on in you as a personality.
Well, the content, I guess maybe we could say, has to do with the sacred and the profane and how these two can come together. That is to say that anything is viable, any form is viable to be included in my work if I wish to do so. Whereas in the building, there's a tradition of art making that I am relating to and reacting against. But in terms of content, I have the option of selecting more or less anything. And so that would be a difference. And then, of course, what it means to look at any one of these forms in the way that they are combined gets into both the form and the content and how the two are interfacing. Once I start to build with them, then the bridge is crossed, it seems.
There also a comment that you seem to have a European and an American aspect, and these two also seem to be in tension with each other. The European, I imagine, would refer to the historical tradition that you're working in, making allusion to constantly, the ambition, and the American, I guess, is something that's apparent in the brassiness, brashness, improvisatory quality. I mean, things that aspects that one thinks of as being specifically and typically American.
And probably the size also.
And the size too, absolutely.
I didn't show any large sculptures, but I've made a number of large outdoor sculptures as well, and I think that is particularly American. And
you yourself are from New England originally. Have spent a lot of time traveling around. I noticed in reading over your biography, you've spent, I mean, not only just tourist time, but significant time in North Africa, Morocco, Peru. So obviously you're engaged with other cultures, other moments in history, and at the same time you're very American. You've managed to bring these things, to keep these things in some sort of a balance.
I
answered the question. Okay, that's the professorial
I'm happy.
part coming out. Are there any last questions before we end? I think we've gone for an hour and a half or so. Yes.
She said something about the scale of her work, why she chooses it.
You want me to speak or
Yeah.
about the size? You mean size and not scale, right? because scale doesn't have to do with size. Scale has to do with the relation of one part to the other. And I've made sculptures that are this size, and they have terrific scale. And then the largest sculpture I've made is 26 feet, and that also has very good scale. And it's because I didn't hire somebody to enlarge it for me, that I worked on it directly in all the processes of the building, which was extremely complicated. I went and looked at a street light, which is 16 feet tall, and then I began to realize that as you walk, after you've got 16 feet, every foot that goes above that has a tremendous amount of perspectival dialogue between the viewer and the form itself. And so I literally had to suspend things in the air in order to figure out what their scale would be in relation to the forms that were below it. And this essentially is what happens in any joining of any two parts. Of course, once one gets involved in that, one has an intuitive response as to how these things are going to go to a certain degree, and then you try to move out into areas that you're not so familiar with.
So you don't make maquettes then?
No, I don't make maquettes.
You always work directly?
In the first few sculptures that I had made drawings for, which were templates, and then I created in wax the various parts. And so that I understood them in a two-dimensional way. It was not only my understanding, but I had to work with a foundry which had never entered into this direct way of working, and so they had to understand what it was I wanted. But once I began to cast directly, then I started to develop an inventory, which could, any one part could be maybe up to 10 years old, and then I would use it whenever I needed it in a particular area.
Yes, one last question. Yeah. The question is the degree of serendipity that enters into the work.
And the other remark was that it sounds very planned. Well, in order to set about, I have to understand maybe 2 or 3 aspects of what it is I want to do. I have to know the size, more or less. I have to know the kind of gesture. And ultimately, I have to know the point at which it's going to make contact with the floor, whether it's going to be a single point or 3 points, and where those spaces will be. And then that allows me to continue, because, of course, in sculpture, you're dealing with gravity, and every single form has a particular weight and specific dimensions. And then there can be serendipity. There can be a lot of discovery along the way, if that's what you mean by serendipity. And that's why it's interesting for me, and that's why I continue to work.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting in listening to your responses how many of the questions, as my own questions tonight and also when we went through the show at the gallery together, want to pin you down to specific kinds of meaning. Someone asked a very interesting question, which I didn't read, which is, beyond beauty, what meaning do you see in your work? And I didn't ask the question not because it's not a very good question, but it's kind of unanswerable question. It seems often to be the kind of question that a critic, perhaps either rightly or wrongly, feels inclined to ask. But I find that most artists, probably very wisely, stop there, and usually the talk has to do with technical matters. Now, I don't mean only technical matters and how it's put together, but what the making of it is, without worrying too much about the implications, and I guess that's part of not wanting to look a gift horse in the mouth. Okay, I thank you very much for staying. Nancy Graves, thank you very much. May I remind those of you who are subscribers that Kenneth Nolan, who will be here on the 15th of November, currently has an exhibition at the Salander O'Reilly Gallery on 79th Street, just west of Madison Avenue, in the old Rosenberg building. I don't remember the address. It's on the south side of the street, so you might want to get over to see that show before the 15th. The show actually closes, I believe, next week. I think on the next week, right before the 11th or so, right before his appearance here. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.